came to pass, when all the people had completely crossed over the Jordan, that the Lord spoke to Joshua, saying, Take for yourselves 12 men from the people, 1 man from every tribe, and command them, saying, Take for yourselves 12 stones from here, out of the midst of the Jordan, from the place where the priest's feet stood firm. You shall carry them over with you and leave them in the lodging place where you lodge tonight. Then Joshua called the 12 men whom he had appointed from the children of Israel, 1 man from every tribe. Joshua said to them, Cross over before the ark of the Lord your God into the midst of the Jordan. And each one of you take up a stone on his shoulder, according to the number of tribes of the children of Israel, that this may be a sign among you. When your children ask in time to come, saying, What do these stones mean to you? Then you shall answer them, The waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, when it crossed over the Jordan, and the waters of the Jordan were cut off. And these stones shall be for a memorial to the children of Israel forever. And the children of Israel did so just as Joshua commanded, and took up 12 stones from the midst of the Jordan, as the Lord had spoken to Joshua, according to the number of tribes of the children of Israel, and carried them over with them to the place where they lodged, and laid them down there. Then Joshua set up 12 stones in the midst of the Jordan, in the place where the feet of the priests who bore the ark of the covenant stood, and they are there to this day. It's kind of refreshing to see the people of Israel obeying for once. Like, I feel like a lot of times we read it and we're like, what are you doing? Why? No, like, he said to do this, not to do that. But then, we look back and we realize that 40 years before this, they didn't obey, right? And so, imagine this, right? Joshua, the people, they've crossed over the river. Joshua is like, I kind of just imagine like this. He's getting ready to take one last step onto the promised land. And God says, wait, I've got one more thing to you. And at first it's like, okay, that's not that big of a deal. God's got one more thing he wants Joshua to do before he goes and enters into the promised land. But if we recall, if we remember, Joshua was one of the original spies that went into the the land, the promised land, before all this took place 40 years ago, right? He was one of those original spies in Numbers, and he went and him and Caleb brought back reports of the land overflowing with milk and honey, right? That this land was just amazing. And he brought that report and said, this is what we see. This land is awesome. This land is great. And sadly, the other spies in that group didn't agree with him, right? The other spies in the land came back saying, like, hey, we can't go there. Those guys are really big and scary looking, and they're going to kill us if we go into that promised land. Like, we can't do that. That's not a thing we can do. And then Caleb and Joshua, they argued with the people, and they were like, no, like, we can take possession. In verse 30 of chapter 13 of Numbers, it says, let us go up at once and take possession, for we are able to overcome. So Joshua had a clear vision of what the promised land was like. He understood how beautiful it was. He understood how great it was. But more importantly, he understood that God had called him to the promised land. And so he knew all these things. He was certain. He knew that that's where they needed to be, that that's where they were to go. And so now, 40 years later, he's finally getting ready to step foot in the promised land. Like, it's finally time. He's been waiting 40 years for this. And God's like, wait, not yet. I got one more thing for you. And I can kind of relate to that, because when we were putting the youth building here on property and we were doing everything for that, it's like I had this clear vision. I knew what I wanted to do. Like, I knew it was from the Lord. I knew what we were supposed to do, and I just wanted to, like, do it. I wanted to go. Let's get it done. But it was like every step, it was like something saying, oh no, but wait, we have to do this. Oh, but wait, we have to do this. Oh, but wait, we have to do that. And then fast forward, we get the building, and now it's like when something comes up, it's like, oh, that'll be fine. We waited long enough for it. That's not really necessary. We can wait some more. And so through Joshua's patience, he learned to be obedient to the Lord. Right? He had to wait 40 years to be able to step foot on the promised land again. And so, and here now, you can think that most people, it's not far off to assume that Joshua might have felt a little frustrated, I'm so close. Do we really need to go get these stones, Lord? Do we really need to? And why do we have to go get the ones in the middle? Can't we just grab the ones that are right at my feet here? I got to go all the way back there. I don't want to. Can we just grab these? But that's not what the Bible teaches us. The idea that's communicated here is that he just said, all right, let's go do it. The Lord gave him a command and said, go do this thing. And he said, all right, let's go. So Joshua grabbed 12 men, right? And they marched down. Now imagine being one of those guys. It's like you've just walked past this giant wall of water. I don't really know how far. Reagan and I were arguing about how far the water was away from them earlier, just for fun. But imagine you're walking past this wall of water, and you got to be sitting there as just a normal Israelite, that's not supposed to be like that. At any moment, that could just fall. You're telling all the little kids, don't touch the water. We don't want to knock it over. When you're in the grocery store and you're going through the aisles and the little kids are knocking things over, you're don't stay close, buddy. Right? And they're on the other side. They're good. They're good to go. And now Joshua's come to them and say, hey, we're going back into the middle. We're going back in to grab some rocks. And they're like, we're going to go get some rocks? But again, the idea here isn't that the men that he chose were all oh, what's going on? Why are we? They got up and they went. That's the idea that's communicated here. And I've really grown to appreciate Joshua as a leader in this sense. Right? Joshua is leading the people of Israel, and he's doing it through his obedience to Christ. Because for 40 years, these guys have seen Joshua continue to be obedient to the Lord. They've seen him time in and time out obey God and his commands. And so now when Joshua says, hey, we're going back in, they're like, yeah, let's do it. Let's go for it. Let's go grab these stones. So they go and they they pick up these stones and they're carrying them out. And before Joshua goes, he sets up 12 more stones. So there's 2 sets of 12. There's the 12 that's going to go for where they encamp that night. And then there's the 12 in the riverbed where the priest's feet were standing during this whole thing. So Joshua takes those 12 and he sets up his own 12 little stones right there in the middle. And so you kind of if you think about that logically, you're like, okay, memorial stones, the whole idea was that we can see them and that we could be reminded of what God did for us, right? That's what it says in here. We're reminded how God split the sea, right? Or the river. But you put them in the water where when the river comes down, we're not going to be able to see those stones, Joshua. They're going to be covered with water, right? And so there's really kind of 2 ways we can apply this and kind of 2 ways that we can look at this. And the first is that these stones were a representation of their old life. And soon when they step outside the river, the waters are going to flood over again and they're going to bury those stones. And they're not going to be visible. And that was true for the Israelites. There was no turning back. Their old lives were buried. And as believers, when we become believers, when we accept the Lord, we become new creations. We are no longer identified as sinners. We are no longer identified in that manner, but we are in that matter. That has been buried. Jesus buries that. And we are identified as saved, as children, as loved, as beloved That's our new identity. And so our old identity gets buried, and we step into our new identity. And that's what the Israelites are doing here as they're crossing into the promised land. They're finally taking the steps into the land that God had promised them so many years before. And their old ways are going to be covered up. The second thing we see is that if these stones were to ever be visible again, that Joshua had planted in the middle, the only logical way that would happen is if there was a drought. Right? So think Maloney's when it gets so hot and the water dries up so much that you start to see the old Parrots Ferry Bridge and all those things start to come out of the water, and you're like, hey, I forgot that was there. Right? It's kind of like that here. In the time of drought, there is a possibility. Now, it doesn't anywhere say that this did happen, but there is a possibility that it could dry up low enough to where maybe the stones are visible from land again. And I thought to myself, that's interesting, but if you really start to think about it, that really applies to us. Because these memorial stones that Joshua set up in the riverbed, and if the river was to dry out, would become visible again. And how many of us have been through dry seasons, right? How many of us have been through droughts in our walks with the Lord where it's tough. You don't really feel Him, you're not really doing, cool things aren't really happening, right? It's not crazy fireworks here or there, people getting saved left and right, in your ministry or whatever. It's just a grind. Right? We walk and we have seasons of dryness, seasons that are a grind as Christians. And even in that grind, we can be reminded that faith in Jesus is still possible, that's still what's going to get us through. Because those stones would be revealed, and the people would look and see them and go, man, yeah, times are tough right now, but you remember when the Lord parted this river so we could enter into the promised land all those years ago? That was pretty cool. It's pretty awesome. And so even though they're not always visible, the Israelites would have faith that they were there. If they were talking with their children about the stones that were set up in the camp, and they're like, but there's also these other stones that you guys can't see, that we can't see, but they're there. Joshua set them up in the middle of the riverbed. And you, by faith, just believing that they're there as a picture. And I think one easy way for you to do this in your life, to set up memorial stones, if you will, for when you're in seasons of dryness, is by journaling. Right? If you have a journal and you write your prayer requests down, I say this and I don't do it. It's one of those things I wish I did, so maybe I'll start doing that today. But I have a friend who does this, and he writes down every prayer request he's ever had, pretty much, in this big journal. He always leaves space for writing down the answer. And it's pretty cool because there's a ton of it, right? Prayer, answer, prayer, answer. And so when he's discouraged, he can just look at it and go, oh man, I remember when that happened. The last time and the only time I've really ever done this is before Rachel and I moved out here 2 years ago. We weren't sure if that's what we were supposed to do, and so I just started writing it down. And then the doors just started opening, and I just would write those things down. And that's an encouragement to me when I need it, like, man, the Lord took care of me then. He can take care of me now. I think my favorite thing about my buddy's journal is that some of the prayer requests are still blank from years ago. And it's like, he's like, yeah, they haven't been answered yet. And then he goes, but look at all this. They're going to be. Just not yet. Because he has hundreds of other answered ones. And that can be a simple way that we remind ourselves in times of dryness. And so now that God's command has been fulfilled, we transition back into our story. The author in this next section is kind of recapping what has just gone down in the last chapter and this chapter so far. So let's take a look at verses 10 through 19. So the priests who bore the ark stood in the midst of the Jordan until everything was finished, that the Lord had commanded Joshua to speak to the people according to all that Moses had commanded Joshua. And the people hurried and crossed over. Then it came to pass, when all the people had completely crossed over, that the ark of the Lord and the priests crossed over in the presence of the people. And the men of Reuben and the men of Gad and the half tribe of Manasseh crossed over armed before the children of Israel, as Moses had spoken to them. About 40,000 prepared for war crossed over before the Lord for battle to the plains of Jericho. On that day the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they feared him as they feared Moses all of his days. Then the Lord spoke to Joshua, saying, command the priests who bear the ark of the testimony to come up from the Jordan. Joshua therefore commanded the priests, saying, come up from the Jordan. And it came to pass, when the priests who bore the ark of the covenant of the Lord had come from the midst of the Jordan, and the soles of the priests' feet touched the dry land, that the waters of the Jordan returned to their place and overflowed all its banks as before. Now the people came up from the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month, and they camped in Gilgal on the east border of Jericho. When we look back in this little recap, this little memorial of what happened, if you will, we see that everything was done to God's standards. Right? It says that until everything was finished, that the Lord had commanded. It sounds kind of like obvious, but the results of obedience to God is that we do things his way. And you're like, well, yeah, that's how obedience works. If you obey somebody, you're doing it the way they wanted it done. But we know that it's real easy to let our plans creep in. We know that it's real easy to let our ideas creep in. Right? What happened 40 years ago in Numbers 13:31? It says, we are not able to go against the people, for they are stronger than we. So even though God promised us this land and told us all we had to do is go over there and take it, what I see is that they're stronger than us, so we want nothing to do with that. The moment that we allow our own thoughts and plans to get in the way of our obedience to God, we're ultimately choosing to disobey. Joshua could have just grabbed, the people could have just grabbed the 12 stones right at their feet in the river and called it good. But they didn't. They did what God commanded them to do. What's the difference? Was there really a difference between these rocks and these rocks? I don't know. Probably not. Maybe the ones in the middle were more smooth. I don't know. More reflective. I don't know. But the difference is that the ones in the middle were the ones that God told them to get. That's the difference between the two. The difference is that Joshua was a man of obedience, and he was a leader of obedience, and when he obeyed, the people followed. So when he said, we're going to obey the word, we're going to obey the commands of God perfectly, as he has said, they followed that. Another result of Joshua's obedience was that the Lord exalted him in the eyes of the people. And this idea is that he became great in their eyes. So the people looked at Joshua and basically like they looked at Moses, like this man's a great leader. That's essentially what it means. The same people that tried to have him stoned 40 years earlier for thinking that they could overtake the nation were the same people that were exalting him now. That looked, well, they weren't. They were their kids. They all died, but, because they disobeyed. But their children now were exalting Joshua. And what's really interesting is that this didn't come from Joshua trying to appease the people. If Joshua wanted to appease the people, he would have simply said, hey, just go grab 12 of these rocks right here. We're good. We'll call it good there. You don't have to go all the way back there. Like, we're good. But Joshua wasn't focused on appeasing the people. He wasn't focused on trying to win the people's hearts by making them feel good. He won their hearts by being completely and 100% obedient to God and what God called him to do, what God commanded him to do. And the Lord was the one who took care of the people's opinions of him. It wasn't Joshua's responsibility to make the people like him. It was Joshua's responsibility to be faithful and obedient to the calling that God gave him. And God took care of the rest. So at the end of this section, God tells Joshua, all right, tell him we're all through. Tell the priests it's time to get out of the water, or out of the river. And the moment they step out of the river, it says that the waters rushed back and filled up all the banks and closed off their passageway. And really at this point, there's no turning back now, right? The people are in the promised land, and they're going forward. The rocks, the memorial rocks down there have been covered, and there's no way left to go but forward into the promised land to start conquering and doing the things that God has called them to do, to live in the promise that God has given them. There's no time to celebrate, right? Because the people were ready. If we recall, 40,000 people of war went first because they understood that it wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't like we crossed this riverbed and the promised land is ours, right? There was still work to be done. There was war to be had. And again, it's a very good picture of the Christian life, right? When we give our lives to the Lord, it's not like it just becomes easy. It gets hard, right? We have to continuously wage war against our flesh. We have to continuously wake up daily and say, I want this, but that's not good for me. That's not what the Lord wants me. I can't have that. It's a continual struggle day in and day out. It's a war that we fight every single day, every single second of every day. But it's a war that has already been won. That's the best part. We're fighting a war that's already been won. Jesus has already won. He's already conquered everything. And if we simply yield to his strength, what we realize is that we aren't the ones fighting the war anyway. We're just bystanders. Jesus is fighting the war on our behalf. And he's winning. He's already won. So they get to this place called Gilgal. And this is kind of going to be their base of operations for the foreseeable future while they work on taking the promised land. Many different important events happen here. Certain kings get put into place here. It's just kind of a place that's very special to them. And so let's look at the last part here. Verse 20 through 24, it says, "And those 12 stones which they took out of the Jordan, Joshua set up in Gilgal. Then he spoke to the children of Israel, saying, When your children ask their fathers in time to come, saying, What are these stones? Then you shall let your children know, saying, Israel crossed over the Jordan on dry land, for the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan before you until you had crossed over, as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea, which he dried up before us until we had crossed over, that all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord, that it is a mighty, that you may fear the Lord your God forever." So they get to their place of camp, and they do what they were told, right? Again, we see the Israelites obeying, Joshua obeying the commands of the Lord. They set up the stones. Now, I didn't touch on it earlier because I wanted to kind of touch on it all at the same time. The reason for the stones, why God wanted it given, is told to us right here, right? The stones had a few purposes, right? The first thing is that they were ultimately to be a memorial to the faithfulness of God, right? God is faithful to create a way, to open a river, to allow his people into the promised land. That is the ultimate purpose. But their reasoning is explained even further. He gives an example, right? More specifically, so that the future generation of Israel might look at these stones and say, hey, what's up with the stones? What's up with the big, shiny, smooth rocks? Like, that's not natural. All the other ones are jagged. What's up with those ones? And then the people of Israel can go, well, you see, this many years ago or whatever, God was super faithful to us. He opened, and he split the river so that we could enter into the promised land after waiting 40 years to finally be able to do that. And that would serve as a source of encouragement for those people. Because they would look at them and go, wow, man, if God was faithful to you back then he's going to continue to be faithful to us right now. The second thing we see is that the fathers, and it specifically says fathers here, but were to lead their children to use the stones as a teaching point for their children. Right? There'd be a way for the parents to be like, see God's faithfulness in our lives. We don't serve a God that is weak. We don't serve a God that isn't faithful. Look what he has done for us. And so this memorial stones would serve that purpose of teaching the young children. And again, I think it's interesting because it says right there that the fathers are to be the ones to do that. As dads, I think that we have a important calling to teach our children about the faithfulness of God and what he's done. We don't leave that up to other people, but we take on that responsibility and do it to the best of our ability. The third thing is that the whole earth would know the power of God. Right? These memorial stones would be used as a picture, as an illustration of this is what God did. This is the power that God has. He parted a river, a giant river, and a Red Sea, and this and that. They serve as teaching points and to show the world the power of God. Why? So that they might fear the Lord forever. So that they might know God. And what's really interesting is that Peter calls us living stones. We, when we are enter into in Christ, we're become living stones. Interesting. And what's interesting about it is that this Peter is such a picture of the Christian life and the purpose behind it. Because when we accept Christ into our lives, the job's not done, right? It gets tough. We got to start working. But through faith in Jesus, over years and decades of growing, we start to develop our own memorial stones in our lives. Things, stories that have happened that we look back to and we can share with those around us. And we remember, hey man, remember when that one Christmas we didn't have money and then money just showed up? Because I remember that as a kid, that happened. And for me, that is a moment of faith that really sticks out that my parents had, that I look back to and go, for whatever reason, that one Christmas where we didn't have any money and we weren't going to have any toys, like, okay, whatever. But then all of a sudden, bunch money for toys showed up. And we had toys for Christmas that year. It's like, it's not that big of a deal. Like, if we didn't get toys, like, whoop-de-doo, you know. But for whatever reason, that memory of God's faithfulness, even in these little things, sticks with me, even to this day. And there's lots of little things like that that happen. I think about last week when Joe, the worship leader, he shared how sometimes when he gets up there to sing, he just doesn't feel like it, right? We've all been there. And it really hit me because I was like, man, I feel like that all the time whenever I'm doing things. But he said that the moment he opens his mouth, the Lord just rushes over him, and it's a sweet time of fellowship, and he never regrets it, right? And he was being open and honest and raw. He was being faithful. He was being obedient for whatever reason. He didn't know that was speaking to people necessarily. He was just being obedient to share what God had put on his heart. And because of Joe's obedience, the Lord used that to minister to me, and I'm sure to more people. And so, thankfully, Joe was obedient to the voice of the Lord, because if we remember, 2.5 tribes stayed. 2.5 tribes did not enter into the promised land. What they had was better, they thought. They still sent their armies to help their brethren, so they didn't totally abandon them. But God also didn't make them enter the promised land. But what's interesting is when the Babylons came, guess who were the first to go? It was those guys who didn't obey the words of the Lord. God calls us to him, and when we accept him, our old life is buried, our old ways of doing things are gone, and we are to live a new life. And the last thing it mentions is why? So that the whole earth can know of God's power. Right? We're called to be different so that the world might know, wow, there's something strange about those guys. Why is that person always nice? Why are they never grumpy? Why don't they cuss? Why don't they get blackout drunk every day? Why are they still married with their spouse? Right? Why are they not why don't they hate these people? Why are they nice to there's a million different ways you can be different than the world, right? And none of us are perfect. But what's really cool about being at the high school is one of our rules, the track team that the head coach has is for the kids, no cussing. And so, obviously we don't, as the coaches, follow the rules, because then they wouldn't follow them. But, we're there, and we're in the van driving the other day, and they're just like, beep, beep, beep. And I'm like, guys, stop. And they're like, well, why don't you cuss? I'm like, well, let me tell you, because I got you now. Yeah. And I'm like, gotcha. Right? But it was just an opportunity that came out of that van ride that I wasn't expecting, that I wasn't trying to make happen. It just happened. Right? And I'm not perfect. But every day I try and ask the Lord, hey, use me today for your purpose. Help me do a little bit better today so that maybe somebody might see Christ through me. So the people have crossed into the promised land. And in the next few chapters, we're going to get to see some cool things happening and just more of God's faithfulness and some of Israel's disobedience and how that all works together. But know that that you aren't called into Christianity and into God's family to be perfect. You're called into his family to surrender, to give up your old ways and follow his ways. You're called into new beginnings. Just like the book of Joshua is about new beginnings, we too are called into new beginnings. Yeah, when we're first saved, but every day we are given the opportunity to step into new beginnings that day. If you're struggling with something, every single day is a new opportunity for you to give up that thing to the Lord, to surrender that area to the Lord, to say, you know what, I've had enough. I've been trying, or I haven't been trying, and it's just causing me grief. Lord, here it is. Take it. And you're not going to be perfect at it. And a lot of times you're not going to do it. But you've already been forgiven of that sin. You've been forgiven of all those things. And even if you're not choosing that very day, that very moment to live in new life, God still loves you. You're still one of his children. And nothing can take that away. But he does have something better for you. His ways are always better than our ways.